At 81, Tony Orlando is facing the kind of news no performer ever wants to hear. The man who once lit up the charts with "Tie a Yellow Ribbon, Round the Old Oak Tree" and filled arenas with his booming voice is now hanging up his touring shoes. Not because he wants to, but because life has dealt him a brutal hand. For fans who grew up with his music, this feels like the end of an era. Tony was the soundtrack to reunions, love stories, and late-night sing-alongs. Now, a heartbreaking diagnosis has forced him to step out of the spotlight for good, leaving everyone wondering how a man who gave so much joy could be stopped so suddenly. Before the yellow ribbon, Tony's Bronx beginnings. Michael Anthony Orlando Cassavetes came into the world on April 3, 1944, the son of a Greek father and a Puerto Rican mother. He grew up on West 21st Street in Chelsea, Manhattan, where the rhythms of New York City were as much a part of his childhood as family dinners. By the time he hit his teenage years, the family had packed up and moved across the river to Union City, New Jersey, and later settled in Hasbrook Heights. Music got its hooks into him early. At just 15, Tony pulled together a little doo-wop group called the Five Gents in 1959, and the boys started cutting demo tapes. Their raw harmonies and ambition got the attention of none other than Don Kirshner, the man who practically ran the Brill-Building hit factory. Suddenly, young Tony found himself writing songs in the same orbit as Carole King, Neil Sedaka, Tony Wine, Barry Mann, Bobby Darin, Connie Francis, and even a struggling duo named Tom and Jerry, better known today as Simon and Garfunkel. Kirshner didn't just put him behind a desk, he pushed Orlando into the booth too. By 16, Tony was already charting as a solo act in North America and the UK, with Bless You and Halfway to Paradise. Imagine that, a kid who hadn't even finished high school, yet suddenly being played on radios across the world. He even hit the stage at the legendary Brooklyn Paramount Theater, performing with the equally legendary DJ Murray, the K. Though he tasted success, the road wasn't always smooth. He had 4 singles that just missed breaking big: Chills in 1962, Shirley and I'll Be There in 1963, and I Was a Boy When You Needed a Man, under the alias Billy Shields in 1969. But even those near misses kept his name floating in the right circles. Then came a surprising twist. Jerry Goffin and Jack Keller crafted a doo-wop version of the classic Beautiful Dreamer for Orlando in 1962. That little record wound up being noticed by none other than the Beatles, who slipped the song into their setlist during their winter 1963 Helen Shapiro tour. Decades later, a live version of it resurfaced on their on-air, live at the BBC Volume 2 album in 2013. Tony may not have been in Liverpool, but his fingerprints were already brushing against the Beatles' early history. While chasing hits, Tony was also hustling behind the scenes. By the late 1960s, he had shifted gears, proving himself as both a producer and a music executive. He climbed the ladder at Columbia Records' publishing arm, April Blackwood Music, and eventually rose to vice president at CBS Music. There, he was signing artists, writing songs, and even producing a young Barry Manilow, back when Barry was recording under the name Featherbed. Tony's desk was stacked with talent. He worked with the Yardbirds, James Taylor, the Grateful Dead, Blood, Sweat and Tears, and Laura Nyro, names that would go on to define entire eras of music. Yet, despite his executive title, Tony couldn't stay away from the microphone. In 1969, he recorded with a studio group called Wind and scored a modest hit with Make Believe, which cracked the top 30. Then came the moment that changed everything: Tony Orlando and Dawn. When Tony Orlando stepped into the studio to record Candida, he had no idea his life was about to change forever. He laid down the vocals with backup singers Tony Wine, the very woman who co-wrote the song, and Linda November. But there was a catch. Tony was still an executive with April Blackwood at the time. And the last thing he wanted was for anyone to accuse him of a conflict of interest, so he agreed to sing only if his name never touched the record. The single was released under a simple throwaway name, Dawn, chosen from the middle name of a Bell Records executive's daughter. That throwaway decision became the spark of a wildfire. Candida exploded worldwide in 1970, shooting to #1 in 5 countries and climbing to #3 in the United States. It was the kind of song that slipped into every jukebox, every living room, and every young couple's soundtrack. And just when people thought it couldn't get bigger, the follow-up proved them wrong. Knock 3 Times didn't just chart, it went straight to #1. Tony knew it was time to take the music on the road, but instead of using the studio voices, he pulled in 2 powerhouse session singers, Thelma Hopkins and Joyce Vincent Wilson, to join him. That's when things got messy. By then, 6 different groups were already touring under the name Dawn. To set the record straight, they rebranded as Dawn, featuring Tony Orlando, and by 1973, the world knew them as Tony Orlando and Dawn. The hits kept coming. Songs like Tie a Yellow Ribbon Round the Old Oak Tree and He Don't Love You Like I Love You turned the trio into household names. But Tony wasn't content to just rule the radio. He had bigger stages in mind. Television came calling, and in the mid-70s, America welcomed Tony Orlando and Dawn into their homes every week. The CBS variety show was sunshine in the middle of a gloomy time. The country was still scarred from Watergate, but Tony brought smiles, laughter, and music that felt like a breath of fresh air. As the San Francisco Chronicle later described it, Tony was a sunny antidote to the nation's cynicism. He wasn't trying to be edgy or cool. He was simply joy wrapped in a voice and a smile. He even drew a little happy face in the O of his autograph, and fans adored him for it. The show ran for 3 seasons from 1974 to 1976 and welcomed the biggest stars of the day, including Tony's childhood heroes, Jackie Gleason and Jerry Lewis. Television became another stage for him. In 1976, he popped up on Chico and the Man as Thomas Garcia. Then came his dramatic turn in 1981's TV movie 300 Miles for Stephanie, where he played a police officer so desperate to save his dying daughter that he vowed to walk 300 miles for God's help. It was a powerful role, starring alongside Edward James Olmos, Pepe Serna, and Julie Carmen, and it showed audiences a side of Tony they had never seen before. That same year, he also stepped onto Broadway, taking over the lead in Barnum while Jim Dale went on vacation. And Tony never stopped reinventing himself. In 2003, a whole new generation met him through the children's animated series Oswald, where he voiced the lovable Sammy Starfish. He wasn't afraid to poke fun at himself either, appearing on Mad TV in a comedy sketch where his voice swayed a courtroom. Later, he showed up in Larry the Cable Guy's star-studded Christmas extravaganza, and in 2012, he had a cameo in Adam Sandler's movie That's My Boy. Even as the decades rolled on, the industry never forgot him. In 2015, standing alongside Thelma Hopkins and Joyce Vincent Wilson, Tony was honored with the Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters Art Gilmore Career Achievement Award, a recognition of a career that spanned hits, television, film, and endless joy. Tony Orlando had gone from a kid cutting demos in New York to a man who could bring the entire nation together with a single song. His career wasn't just about music, it was about the way he made people feel. And for millions of fans, that feeling never went away. But behind the laughter, the applause, and the television appearances, there was another story. A story of struggle that fame could never erase. Tony Orlando's addiction battles. At 81, Tony Orlando has lived a life filled with dazzling highs and crushing lows. He was one of the most famous entertainers in the world during the 1970s, a man who could fill arenas with his voice and charm millions from their living rooms each week. But behind the stage lights, Tony was carrying battles that fame couldn't shield him from. And one summer night, In 1977, it all came crashing down. By the mid-70s, the pressure of non-stop touring, recording, and television was already taking its toll. To keep up, Tony turned first to over-the-counter caffeine pills. In a Washington Post interview years later, he confessed he would take 4 Vivarin before even brushing his teeth. But when tragedy struck, pills weren't enough. His close friend, comedian Freddie Prinze, died by suicide in 1976. Just 2 days later, Tony's sister, the person he often described as his first audience, also passed away. Grief consumed him, and in his desperation, he began using coke in what he admitted was a frantic and enormous amount. On July 22, 1977, while performing at the South Shore Music Circus in Cohasset, Massachusetts, the weight of it all finally broke him. In front of 3,000 fans, Tony reached his breaking point. He later remembered that all he wanted in that moment was to whisper for help, to be allowed off stage to see a doctor. Instead, he walked off mid-performance, leaving the crowd stunned. He pushed through 3 more shows before canceling the rest of the tour. Doctors diagnosed him with manic exhaustion and began treatment with lithium. For the public, the collapse was shocking. This was the same man who had given the world "Tie a Yellow Ribbon Round the Old Oak Tree," a number. One anthem that had become a symbol of hope for military families, and who had turned Tony Orlando and Dawn into one of CBS's biggest variety shows. But behind the curtain, his world was falling apart. Tony later admitted that just 9 months of cocaine use had wrecked nearly everything he had built. It clouded his judgment, strained his marriage, poisoned his self-respect, and cost him the television show that had made him a household name. And through it all, the loss of Freddie Prinze haunted him. In a CNN interview with Larry King, he remembered the devastation vividly, standing alongside Freddie's wife and mother in the aftermath of his death. It was, he recalled, one of the most horrific experiences of his life, and one that scarred him deeply. The weight of grief, addiction, and exhaustion finally drove him into rehab. And that's where Tony Orlando found his turning point. He emerged recommitted to the values that had shaped him as a boy. On the 700 Club, he described himself as a born-again Christian, crediting his grandmother's prayers and his religious upbringing for pulling him back from the edge. That season of collapse and recovery, he later said, became the most transformational year of his life. But life wasn't just about redemption and second chances, it was also about the heart. Tony Orlando's love life. Long before the bright lights and sold-out arenas, Tony Orlando was just a kid figuring out life, and love had a funny way of finding him. One of his earliest romantic encounters was with none other than Sue Butterfield, the real-life muse behind Dion's iconic "Run Around Sue." Tony took her out to dinner, and the night was unforgettable, mostly for her obsession with someone else. She spent the entire evening professing her love for Dion, leaving Tony to laugh about it years later, joking that he's the only guy in the world she ran around with. Fate, however, had other plans. Enter Jerry Lee Lewis, the wild man of rock and roll, who introduced Tony to Elaine, a devoted fan club president who had once dated Buddy Holly. Tony had met her briefly while working on the Murray the K show, and when they reconnected later, sparks flew. The two tied the knot in 1965 and welcomed their son, John, into the world. For nearly 2 decades, Elaine stood beside Tony as he soared to fame, navigating the dizzying highs and the unavoidable lows. But by 1984, their marriage came to an end, leaving Tony to find his way back to love once more. 5 years later, life handed him another chance at happiness, this time at the most unlikely of places, Disneyland. Tony was working there with his group when he befriended Jim Amormino, head of the Orange County Police Force. Through that friendship, he met Francine Amormino. It wasn't love at first sight. They knew each other years before, but 8 years after his divorce, destiny nudged them together again. Spotting her, Tony blurted, "Are you Franny?" She was. Francine wasn't your typical Hollywood starlet. She came from the fashion world and brought a steady, grounding presence to Tony's whirlwind life. In April 1990, they married, and their union has lasted ever since. Together, they welcomed a daughter, Jenny Rose, and Francine became his anchor, offering support through both the triumphs and trials of life. Even as fame followed Tony wherever he went, he never lost his sense of humor about love. He's admitted that his dinner with Sue Butterfield was fleeting. About half a beat, he jokes, but those little moments, both brief and life-changing, are what make his story so human. From fleeting flings to lasting devotion, Tony Orlando's love life has been as rich and surprising as the music that made him famous. Yet, while love gave him stability, fame sometimes brought conflict and betrayal. From friends to foe, Tony Orlando and Wayne Newton were once two of Branson, Missouri's biggest names, sharing a bond built on music, fame, and, for a time, friendship. Orlando had already made a name for himself with Dawn, recording 3 #1 hits. One hits, Tie a Yellow Ribbon Round the Old Oak Tree, Knock 3 Times, and He Don't Love You, Like I Love You, and even starred in a CBS variety show in the 1970s. Newton, meanwhile, never hit #1 on the pop charts, though his classics like Danke Schoen and Red Roses for a Blue Lady were familiar to millions. By maintaining a relentless schedule, mostly in Las Vegas, Newton was said to have become the highest-paid nightclub performer in history. Though they took slightly different paths to fame, both mined the same sort of fun, schmaltzy material. They even dropped their first names. Carson Wayne Newton removed Carson, while Michael Anthony Orlando Cassavitis ditched both first and last names. In 1997, Orlando invited Newton to share the stage at Tony's Yellow Ribbon Theater in Branson. By April 1998, they leased a theater together, christening it the Talk of the TOWN Theater, an acronym for Tony Orlando Wayne Newton. Sadly, all they share today is their April 3rd birthday and a mutual hatred for each other. Their theater on Highway 65, at the junction of Highway 248, had once been the talk of the town, but almost a year after opening, Newton and his wife locked Orlando out in the December cold. What could have put good friends at odds? A juicy he said, she said saga involving accusations of illegal wiretapping, conspiracy, planted evidence, and even the alleged kidnapping of a young girl's Christmas toys, all playing out in a Springfield, Missouri, federal courtroom where the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act made a cameo. In Orlando's version, he had learned that Newton was considering leaving Branson due to disputes with 2 other theater owners. Wanting to help his friend, Orlando offered him a gig at the Yellow Ribbon Theater. When Orlando's lease ended, he reportedly insisted that Newton be included in any new venue deal. The Glenn Campbell Theater agreed, and the theater was renamed the Talk of the TOWN Management, and operations were handled by White Eagle Inc., a theater company wholly owned by Kathleen McCrone Newton, Wayne's lawyer wife. Orlando claimed that Kathleen Newton soon became the problem. She denied him access to expense accounts, raised the cost of his contributions to the joint Kitty Fund, and tried to bully him into renegotiating the contract. Matters came to a head on December 9, 1998, when Newton's team met with Orlando and his people in Wayne's dressing room, though Wayne himself had left hours earlier. Orlando reported that he discovered the meeting was being secretly recorded, and a search revealed a tape recorder hidden in a houseplant. Days later, the Newtons locked Orlando out and canceled his 11 remaining Christmas shows. Orlando responded with an 11-count, $15 million lawsuit, alleging that the Newtons' actions had been motivated by malice. He claimed the suit covered illegal wiretapping under the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act, a civil conspiracy to record Orlando without consent, and an effort to remove him from the theater so Newton could claim it entirely as his own. Orlando's publicist likened the situation to a Shakespearean drama, describing Tony as Duncan, Wayne as Macbeth, and Kathleen as Lady Macbeth, seizing control of the kingdom by shouting out, "Damned spotlight." Newton's side was just as dramatic. He claimed Orlando failed to pay his share of expenses to White Eagle Inc., straining their business relationship. Newton alleged Orlando misrepresented his drawing power, with shows filling less than half of the 750-seat theater, making it a money-losing operation. Regarding the taping, Newton maintained it was actually Orlando who planted a wireless microphone in his dressing room, intended to investigate thefts and vandalism involving Newton's personal and professional property. Newton's $20 million countersuit described Orlando's actions as willful, wanton, and malicious, accusing him of spreading false statements about withholding personal items, including the alleged holding of his daughter's Christmas toys. Even the origins of their partnership were disputed. Orlando claimed he brought Newton to Branson and ensured his inclusion in the theater deal, while Newton insisted that it was he who was approached by the Glenn Campbell people, with Tony added only after certain conditions were met. The mystery of the taping escalated when Newton argued that sound equipment on stage captured the meeting, and that Orlando's team had secretly started recording. Orlando reportedly informed Newton's representative of a wireless microphone at intermission, which led to the discovery of the bug in a houseplant. Local Branson officials were left scratching their heads. The public relations manager for the Branson Lakes Area Chamber of Commerce said no one really understood what happened, admitting that the community reacted with a collective darn. Everyone knew there had been a tiff, but the complexity and drama were beyond ordinary lives, leaving residents to hope that somehow it could be worked out. Despite the acrimony, Orlando remained focused on his career. His publicist reported that Tony initially struggled to accept that someone he had considered a friend acted against him, but he was now thriving and had plans to headline the Taj Mahal in Atlantic City. Even with the spinning legal theatrics and public attention, Orlando refused to let Newton's feud overshadow the next chapter of his life. In the end, what happened between Orlando and Newton is a cautionary tale of friendship turned rivalry, where fame, ambition, and family entanglements collided. Branson may have been on the stage, but the drama offstage rivaled anything they ever performed, proving that even in show business, trust can be fragile. Yet as one storm subsided, another was brewing, this time closer to home. The sexual harassment charges. In 1998, Tony Orlando found himself in the center of a storm. Two former backup singers at his Yellow Ribbon Theater in Branson, Missouri, sisters Sonia and Aleta Buccaleo, accused him of constant berating and verbal abuse. Their lawsuit claimed sexual harassment and discrimination, painting Orlando as someone who abused his power. The sisters asked the jury to stand up for someone without authority and sought $50,000 each for the pain and suffering they said he had caused. They had originally pursued back pay too, but eventually dropped that demand. The courtroom became a tense arena. Witnesses described Orlando as a man who frequently shouted at nearly everyone he employed, creating a stressful environment. The sisters' attorneys stressed the emotional toll, framing him as volatile and overbearing. Orlando's defenders didn't deny that he could be tough, but they argued he never meant to hurt anyone, pointing out that he often apologized after outbursts. His lawyer made it clear that in a challenging business, Orlando could be demanding, but he had done nothing illegal, and the sisters had failed to prove their case. The trial, presided over by U.S. District Judge Russell G. Clark, ran for weeks. More than a dozen witnesses took the stand, including Orlando himself. Each side presented a dramatically different picture of life behind the scenes at the Yellow Ribbon Theater. The sisters emphasized tension and intimidation, while Orlando's team highlighted dedication, passion, and a work environment that could be rough but not criminal. When the jury deliberated, they concluded that the sisters had not provided enough evidence to support their claims. The jury foreman clarified that Orlando's fame had no bearing on their decision, insisting that they treated him just like any other witness. Aleta Bukalu reflected afterward that the outcome wasn't surprising, noting that celebrities often seem untouchable in today's world. Walking out of the courtroom, Orlando was cleared of all charges. The last 2 years had weighed heavily on him, with people around him assuming the worst and treating him like a sexual harasser or slimeball. But the verdict brought a sense of relief and freedom he found hard to put into words. He reflected on the experience as a reminder that anyone, regardless of intentions or reputation, could find themselves facing a courtroom battle. The real reason why Tony Orlando isn't touring anymore. After decades of captivating audiences, Tony Orlando was ready to close the curtain on his illustrious career, but not for the reason you might expect. But before stepping away, he embarked on a farewell tour to say a heartfelt goodbye to his fans. According to Billboard, the musician concluded his touring career with a farewell tour that began with 3 shows in Las Vegas, Nevada, before traveling to major cities across the United States and Canada, including Atlantic City, Niagara Falls, and more. Fans were treated to Orlando performing most of his classic hits, making the tour an emotional series of shows after over 51 years in the music industry. In an interview with the outlet, Orlando explained why he decided to retire after working in the music industry for over 5 decades. He noted that he still hit the ball but couldn't run the bases. He also explained that the travel costs and his age were the main contributing factors to why he wanted to retire now. Even though he stopped performing, the singer didn't retire from working at all. He added, "It's also time for me to satisfy my creative juices with the need in me to produce, to create new products, from films to Broadway shows to streaming new products." In addition, Orlando launched his companies called Tony Orlando Productions and Explosive Films and Entertainment. It seemed like the singer would still have a busy career, as he planned to get serious about writing his Broadway show and writing his new book. Beyond the music, Tony has always championed causes close to his heart. A longtime advocate for U.S. military veterans, his iconic "Tie a Yellow Ribbon Round the Old Oak Tree" has become an anthem for service members everywhere. He serves on the board of directors for the Eisenhower Foundation and holds the title of Honorary Chairman for Snowball Express, an organization dedicated to the children of fallen military heroes. He hosts the annual Congressional Medal of Honor dinner in Dallas and has served as Master of Ceremonies at the Secretary of Defense Freedom Awards at the Pentagon. Tony's career has been decorated not just with hits, but with honors that recognize his dedication and heart. Casino Entertainer of the Year, Best All-Around Entertainer, Las Vegas 4 times, the Jukebox Artist of the Year Award from the Amusement and Music Owners Association of New York, the Ellis Island Medal of Honor, and the Bob Hope Award for Excellence in Entertainment from the Congressional Medal of Honor Society. His work on behalf of veterans led to his being named Honorary Chairman at the 40th Anniversary NAM POW's Homecoming Celebration at the Richard M. Nixon Presidential Library in 2014. Through decades of fame, music, service, and triumph, Tony Orlando has left a mark on us, one that stretches far beyond the stage. For fans, for veterans, for anyone touched by his songs and his deeds, his legacy isn't just about the music. It's about heart, humanity, and the joy of leaving the world a little brighter than you found it. Which Tony Orlando song is your favorite? And what do you think about the bitter feud between Wayne Newton and Tony Orlando? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.